All right, happy Sabbath to you all. Now in the sermon time today, I'll be starting a brand new series, a biographical series on the patriarchs and drawing out lessons that we can learn from their lives. Now today on the Biography channel, we'll be starting this series by looking at the life of the father of the faithful, Abraham. Now the story of the patriarch Abraham is told to us from Genesis 11 through to Genesis 25. Now I did have a handout to give you today, but I forgot to bring it, so when I do part 2 I will bring that along. Now on the handout there's a brief explanation of what happens in each of those chapters, along with the lessons that we're going to be drawing out, plus a few other charts, so look forward to that next time. Now the important chapters that deal with the promises that God gave to Abraham are firstly Genesis 12, where God tells Abraham to go to the land of Canaan and promises to make a great nation from him. Then in Genesis 15, God formalises the covenant with Abraham and promises him a son from his own body and the land from the Euphrates to Egypt. Now in Genesis 17, God expands the promise, saying many nations shall come, not just from him, but Sarah, who will give birth to the promised son. Now circumcision is given as a sign of that particular covenant, and God changes his name and that of his wife to Abraham and Sarah. And then in Genesis 22, after Abraham was willing to offer Isaac, God reiterates the promise and adds the promise of his descendants possessing the gates of their enemies. Now Abraham is introduced to us at the end of Genesis 11 as a son of the 10th generation after Noah's flood. Now he was born around 1950 BC as one of 3 sons of Terah. Now Eber, who was of the 4th generation after Noah, is where we get the name for the Hebrews from. Now Eber's son Peleg was given that name because of the division that occurred during his life, probably being a reference to the scattering at the Tower of Babel. Now according to the figures given in Genesis, Noah, who lived to the grand old age of 950 years old, died just 2 years before Abraham was born. Now his son Shem, who according to legend was a righteous servant of God, lived for 600 years and died around 1800 BC. Now Shem was not only alive when Abraham moved to Canaan, but lived until Isaac was 50 years old, dying only 10 years before the birth of Jacob. Now Abraham's grandfather and one of Abraham's brothers both had the same name of Nahor. Now this name probably has the funniest meaning of any name in the entire Bible, as the name of Nahor means snorer. Now here is a diagram showing Abraham's family tree. This will be on the handout. Now Abraham's father Terah had 3 sons, Haran, Nahor and Abraham. Now through a second wife, Terah has a daughter by the name of Sarah, or Sarai to begin with, who would become Abraham's wife. Now in Genesis 17 verse 17, it notes that when Isaac was born that Sarah was 90 years old and Abraham was 100 years old. So Abraham is 10 years older than his wife, who is also his half-sister. Now up until Genesis 17, when God changes their names, Abraham and Sarah are referred to as Abram and Sarai. Now Haran is evidently the oldest of the sons of Terah. Now his son is Abraham's nephew Lot. Now Abraham also has 2 daughters by the names of Milcah and Ishka. Now Nahor is married to his niece Milcah, the daughter of his brother Haran. Now on the other side, the first 2 sons of Nahor and Milcah are called Huz and Buz, which are names that make me giggle every time I hear them. Now another son of Nahor is Bethuel, who is father to Rebekah, Isaac's wife, as well as Laban, whose 2 daughters will later marry Jacob. Now in addition to Abraham's sons of Isaac and Ishmael, Abraham remarries in his old age after Sarah dies and through his second wife Keturah, he has another 6 sons. Now, marrying one's half-sister in the case of Sarah, and one's niece, as in the case of Milcah and Nahor, would later become prohibited at the time of the Exodus. Now, prior to that, children from such unions did not pose the same level of genetic risk as they would later on as genetic degradation began to compound. Now, some critics have claimed that Genesis was not written until at least the 10th century BC, when Hebrew comes along on the scene, or later. But these details of marrying one's half-sister or niece show that it wasn't written as late as the time of Israel's kings, as these customs and others, like some of the inheritance customs in Abraham's story, were either prohibited or later different in the time of Israel's kings. Now, in Genesis 11, starting in verse 26, we read that Terah begot Abraham, Nahor, and Haran. Now, Abram, the original name of Abraham, is placed first, making it appear that Terah was 70 years old when he begot Abraham. Now, a few chapters earlier, Shem is also listed first in the list of Noah's sons, though Genesis 10:21 plainly states that Japheth was the oldest. Now, we can see here the first listed is not necessarily the firstborn, but the one given preeminence in these particular cases. Now, in Genesis 12 verse 4, it says that Abraham was 75 years old when he left Haran. Now, if Abraham was the firstborn when Terah was 70 years old, then Abraham would have been at least 135 years old when Terah died at age 205 in Haran. Now, in Genesis 12:1, God tells Abraham to get out from his father's house, which implies that Terah was still alive when Abraham left Haran. Now, this is how the Jews interpret it, believing that Abraham was the firstborn and that Terah died 60 years after Abraham left Haran. Now, it's only in the New Testament, in Acts 7 verse 4, where we find confirmation that Abraham only left Haran after his father's death. Now, according to Jewish chronology, our year, 2020, which hasn't turned out to be such a great one after all, is year 5780 since Adam was created. Now, they believe that there's over 200 years to go before 6,000 years is clocked up since creation. Now, that 200-year difference compared to what we believe comes from a combination of these extra 60 years we see here in the story of Abraham and their very strange compression of the length of the Persian Empire from around 200 years down to just over 50 years in length. Now, notice a couple of details here in relation to Terah moving his clan out of Ur of the Chaldees. Now, his son Haran has died, but he takes Haran's son Lot as well as Abraham, but he does not take Nahor to the city of Haran. So why didn't Terah take Nahor with him? Well, we're not actually really told why in the scriptures, though perhaps he may have snored too much. Now, the second detail to notice here is that when Terah moves the clan, Terah intends to go to the land of Canaan. Haran, where he dies, is not his intended final destination. Now, was he going there because he followed God and was told by God to go there? We're not told, but that's one possibility. Now, in Joshua 24 verse 2, it states that Terah served other gods. Yet Genesis 31:53 strongly implies that the God of Terah was the same God of Abraham when Laban tells Jacob, the God of Abraham, the God of Nahor, and the God of their father, who was Terah, judge between us. So we see that there was a degree of mixed worship of both the true God and other gods in the family of Terah. Now, Abraham was solely devoted to the true God, at least from the time that he left Haran. Now, we find, though, that the mixed worship continued in the family of Nahor. Now, when Jacob flees from Nahor's grandson Laban, it says in Genesis 31:34 that Rachel took his household idols with her. And we also read in Genesis 35 verse 2 of Jacob commanding those in his household, who included many from Laban's family, to put away their foreign gods. Now, the way that Terah had allowed such mixed worship into his family is a good indication that he had little contact with Noah, who died shortly before Abraham was born, or with Noah's son Shem. Now, legendary evidence indicates Noah, late in his life, was based mostly in southern Europe, where Shem was also after he dealt with Nimrod, as preserved in the Egyptian myth of Seth's defeat of Osiris. Now, Abraham's Ur is most often identified with the famous Ur that British archaeologist Leonard Woolley excavated in the 1930s in southern Babylon, despite how far away it is from Haran, where they stayed for a time before then moving on to the land of Canaan. Now, is this where Ur of the Chaldees was, or was it in a different location closer to Haran? Now, there's a couple of reasons why the southern Ur in Babylonia is usually identified with Ur of the Chaldees. Now, the Babylonian Empire was also known as the Chaldean Empire, and in Daniel and Esther, Nebuchadnezzar and many of his court officials are referred to as Chaldean, similar to the name Chaldees. Now, the second reason is because of the fame of this site after British archaeologist Leonard Woolley excavated some fabulous treasures at the southern Ur in Babylon in the 1930s. Now, the other main contender for Ur of the Chaldees is a town that is today called Sanalurfa, but in ancient times was known as Urfa and Edessa. Now, this Urfa is a little way northwest of Haran, where Terah died. Now, it's near the border of Turkey and Syria, where there has been plenty of recent fighting between the Turks and the Kurds. Now, there's a cave under Urfa's citadel that local legend says is Abraham's birthplace. In Joshua 24 verse 2, it tells us that Abraham's family dwelt on the other side of the river, which is believed to mean the river Euphrates, though it could possibly refer to the river Jordan as well. Now, the southern Ur that Woolley excavated is on the same side of the Euphrates as the land of Israel, unlike Urfa, which is on the opposite side of the Euphrates River. Now, this Urfa is close to other towns which have names close to the names of members of Abraham's family, such as Tilterah, Surak, and Haran. Now, Sinai, like Shinar, is another nearby town. And there's many nearby places that include the name Kale in them, which is similar to Chaldee or Chaldees. Now, the Chaldees, spelled Khaldis, was the name of the pantheon of gods of the Hurrians who lived in southeast Turkey close to Mount Ararat. And this is the likely derivation for the term Chaldees. Now, remember before we saw how Nahor stayed behind in Ur of the Chaldees and didn't go with Terah and Abram to Haran. Now, in Genesis 24, Abraham tells his servant to go back to my country. And so he went to Mesopotamia, to the city of Nahor. Now, Nahor is no longer alive, and his servant meets his son Bethuel and grandson Laban of Paddan Aram in Syria. Now, we find later when Jacob has to flee from Esau, he also goes to Laban, who we are told is in Haran. Now, assuming Laban hasn't moved location, the city of Nahor here that Abraham's servant went to is equated with Haran. So we see from these verses we have to deduce that sometime after Terah left Haran, that Nahor also went to Haran. And the most logical reason for that would be when he heard the news that Terah was close to death. Now, in Genesis 24, verse 4, Abraham said that where Nahor's family was, that is Haran as we saw before, was my country. Now, why would he call Haran my country if where he was originally came from, was all the way down in southern Babylon? Now, this is probably the strongest support for the northern being the that Abraham came from. Now, in Genesis 12 verse 4, it says that Abraham was 75 years old when he left Haran for the land of Canaan. Now, the Canaanites were olive to brown-skinned descendants of Ham, not unlike today's Arab people. Now, Ham's other sons included Nimrod's father Cush, as well as Mitzrayim, who was the ancestor of the Egyptians. Now, they were only meant to be in this part of the Middle East short-term until the rightful owners came to possess the land and they would be driven out by God, most likely south towards Africa and Arabia, where Ham's other descendants migrated to. Now, in Hebrews 11 verse 8, it says that Abraham faithfully obeyed God to make this big move, and then he went out not knowing where he was going. Now, this was a gutsy, courageous thing to leave the place where he was comfortable with and to obey God not knowing where he was going. Now, this brings us to the first lesson that we can learn from Abraham's life. Have the courage to leave what is comfortable and follow God even when you're not sure where doing it God's way will take you. Now, this might include moving to a new place, or coming to church for the first time, or breaking off a relationship that's pulling you away from God. Now, there are many things that God calls us to do that take courage and moving out of our comfort zone. Now, after the flood, the earth's inhabitants once again began to turn their back on God. By Abraham's time, all peoples had again grown corrupt. Now, in our booklet, The United States and Britain in Bible Prophecy, it says, God then set in motion a major aspect of his plan to offer salvation to mankind. Selecting Abraham was a crucial step in God's long-term plan to turn all nations back to him. The remainder of the Bible is woven around his plan to reconcile all humanity to himself. Now, really let this next paragraph really sink in. It says that God chose Abraham and promised to develop his descendants into a group of influential nations chosen for the purpose of teaching and illustrating his values and way of life to the rest of the world. End of quote. Now, when Mark Robertson spoke about the first century church in Brisbane, he made the point that God wanted his people to be a light on a hill and attract Gentiles to him, rather than creating an exclusivist religious system just for Israelites that the Gentiles could not be a part of. Now, the purpose of this Abrahamic covenant is outlined 3 times in the book of Genesis. In Genesis 12 verse 3 we read, "And I will bless those that bless you and curse those who curse you, and in you all families of the earth will be blessed." Now, in Genesis 22 verse 18 we read, "And in your seed shall all the nations of the earth be blessed, because you have obeyed my voice." And in Genesis 28 verse 14 we read, "And your seed shall be like the dust of the earth, and you shall spread abroad to the west and to the east and to the north and to the south. And in you and in your seed shall all the families of the earth be blessed." Now, it was God's intention that all the nations of the world be blessed by what he was going to do through the nations descended from Abraham. God was going to use both Abraham and his seed, the nation of Israel, to bless all nations of the world through the example that they were to set as a model nation to help and bless other nations. And that's something that won't really reach its major fulfillment until after the return of Jesus Christ. Now, also, Jesus Christ was a descendant of Abraham, and he was also a seed of Abraham, whose sacrifice would open up salvation an entrance into God's kingdom, as Paul spoke about in Galatians 3:16. Now, just as an aside, notice the cardinal directions in Genesis 28:14: west, east, north and south. Now that just happens to correspond with the chronological order of the expansion of the British Empire: west to America and the Caribbean, east to India, north to Canada, and then south to Australia, New Zealand and South Africa. Now, there's been a rather persistent myth that has continued to be perpetuated that the slavery of the Israelites lasted some 400 years. Now, this is based on a misunderstanding of Exodus 12 verse 40 that says that the sojourning of Israel was 430 years. Now, Paul says in Galatians 3:16 and 17 that from Abraham, when the promises were made, till Mount Sinai and the giving of the law was that same period of time, 430 years. Now, Josephus further explains that the 430 years was from when Abraham came into Canaan till the Exodus, and that Jacob moving to Egypt till the Exodus was exactly half that period, 215 years. Now, it's interesting the use of that phrase, the self-same day, in Exodus 12:40. Now, this indicates that Abraham left for the land of Canaan on the same day that the Israelites left Egypt, the first day of unleavened bread. Now, this is quite fitting, as this fits the typology of us coming out of sin. Now, the first place that Abraham stops at in the land of Canaan is the town of Shechem, in the central highlands, where the Israelites would later confirm the covenant by reciting the blessings and cursings, with half the tribes on Mount Gerizim and the other half on Mount Ebal. Now, at Shechem, in Genesis 12:7, it says that the Lord appeared to Abram and said to your descendants, I will give this land. So it says here that the Lord visibly appeared to him and gives the first promise of the land that he is passing through. Now, he builds an altar there, and then the next place that he goes to is Bethel, halfway between Shechem and Jerusalem on the ridge route, where he builds another altar. Now, not long into his stay there is a terrible famine, and so he goes down to Egypt for food. Now, on his way to Egypt, Abraham starts worrying about the possibility of Pharaoh wanting to take his wife to himself because she is so good looking. Now, just bear in mind that Sarah is about 65 years old at this time. Now, he fears Pharaoh may even kill him in order to take his wife, so he concocts a plan to tell a half-truth out of fear to protect himself. They will only say that Sarah is his sister, but not his wife. Now, we see here that Abraham is mingling with Pharaoh's court and his courtiers, and those courtiers point out Sarah's beauty to the Pharaoh, who is immediately taken by her beauty and takes her into his palace and treats Abraham well because of her. Now, God then intervenes and sends plagues on Pharaoh and his court, who then find out that Sarah is also Abraham's wife. Now, Pharaoh is rightfully upset with him. He gives Sarah back to him and sends him on his way back to Canaan. Now, it's likely here in Egypt where they pick up Sarah's handmaid Hagar from. Now, some 25 years later, we find Abraham making exactly the same mistake. In Genesis 20, in the months between the destruction of Sodom and Gomorrah and when Sarah conceives Isaac, Abraham is dwelling in Gerar in the southwest of Israel. Now, rather than trusting God to protect him, of which he had evidence for in Egypt, he again lets his fear get the better of him, telling the same half-truth that Sarah was only his sister. Now, like Pharaoh, Abimelech is so taken with Sarah's beauty, even though she is now 90 years old. He takes her into his harem. Now, she must have been quite stunning to have this sort of effect on men. Now God again gets Abraham out of this mess that his fear has created by warning Abimelech not to take Sarah as a wife. Abimelech is rightfully upset with Abraham and restores Sarah back to him. Now, who was the Pharaoh that Abraham interacted with when he was in Egypt? Now, according to French archaeologist Claude Schaeffer, there was a catastrophe that brought an end to the early Bronze Age right across the entire Middle East. Now, when we look at the destruction of Sodom and Gomorrah in part 2, we'll look at why I believe that this event is best dated to the end of the early Bronze Age, when there was a great catastrophe that befell the whole entire Middle East. Now, in the palace of Naram Sin that was destroyed at the end of the early Bronze Age, an alabaster was found of a pharaoh called Pepi I from the early 6th dynasty. Now, if this dynasty was indeed contemporary with the time of Abraham, this pharaoh may quite well have been the pharaoh that Abraham interacted with in Genesis 12. Now, in Genesis 13, verses 7 to 9, we read, "And there was strife between the herdsmen of Abraham's cattle and the herdsmen of Lot's cattle. And the Canaanite and the Perizzite lived then in the land. And Abraham said to Lot, 'Let there be no strife, I pray you, between me and you, and between my herdsmen and your herdsmen. For we men are brothers. Is not the whole land before you? I pray you, separate yourself from me. If you go to the left, then I will go to the right. Or if you go to the right, then I will go to the left.'" Now, this brings us to the second lesson that we can learn from Abraham's life. Humility and deference to the needs of others is vital to living at peace with other people. Now, sometimes we have to have the humility to let the other person have their way, as Abraham did with his nephew Lot, even though as patriarch of the household, Abraham had the right to have his way. Now, a little humility and less insistence on what we want can go a very long way to resolving problems that we have with other people. Yes, there are some points of morality that we should not compromise on, but with everything else, such as our day-to-day desires and wants, we should be flexible and willing to compromise. Now, immediately before his instructions to husbands and wives, Paul says in Ephesians 5:21 that we should submit ourselves one to another. In other words, be willing to defer to what others want and need rather than insisting on our way all the time. Now, Lot then settles in Sodom and appears to later be an elder of the city, rendering judgment in the gate. Now, the Dead Sea, according to the Genesis account, was not yet in existence in the days of Abraham. The Valley of Siddim, where there were several cities, including Sodom and Gomorrah, is equated with the Salt or Dead Sea in Genesis 14:3. The expression that is the Salt Sea is likely an editorial note that was added much later to let the readers know where these cities that God destroyed were located. Now, this area around Sodom had been under tribute for about 12 years to the kings over Mesopotamia, but the locals have decided to rebel against paying the annual tribute. So an alliance of 4 kings from the east come to pillage, and in the process, Lot is captured. Now, as they head back to Mesopotamia, Abraham hears about it and courageously goes after them and to rescue Lot and the others, with 318 trained servants born in his household. Now, between Dan and the north of Damascus, during their daring night raid, he rescues them all and the goods that they plundered. Now, Genesis 14 tells us that the names of the kings were Amraphel, king of Shinar. Now, Shinar here is another name for Mesopotamia. The next king is Kedorlaomer, king of Elam, which is today's Iran. Then Arioch, king of Elasar, which may be the Mesopotamian city of Larsa, or alternatively Ashur. And the last king is Tidhal, king of Goyim. The Goyim is Hebrew for nations. So these kings ruled a very large part of Mesopotamia and beyond. And so they would have had quite a strong army. Now, there's actually been a tablet that was found which told of a battle where the king of Elam, Curto-Lagana, led an alliance of rulers that included one named Aryaku and another named Tadugala, names similar to 3 of the 4 kings listed in Genesis 14. Now, after the victory, the king of Sodom goes to meet Abraham to see the people that Abraham has rescued from his town. Now, the location is noted as the King's Valley, which Josephus places in the Kidron Valley near Jerusalem. Now, Abraham is then greeted by a mysterious person known as Melchizedek, who is identified as the king of Salem and priest of God Most High. Now, in his discussion on tithing in Hebrews 7, the Apostle Paul mentions that the kings of the east were slaughtered. And he says that Abraham tithed on the spoils minus the goods captured from the cities of the plain. Now, the name Melchizedek means king of righteousness, and Salem means peace. So fully translated, Paul says that his name is King of Righteousness, King of Peace, and Priest of the Most High God, and that he has no beginning of days nor end of life. In other words, this priest was an eternal being. Now, we teach that this Melchizedek was another appearance of the Lord who later became Jesus Christ. Now, did he actually rule over a city of people where Jerusalem is today in Abraham's time? Now, the earliest confirmed archaeological remains in Jerusalem only go back to the Middle Bronze Age, not to the early Bronze Age when Abraham lived. Now, there may have been a city there in Abraham's time, as this meeting occurred in the Kidron Valley right next to Jerusalem. Now, alternatively, King of Salem may have just been a title as implied here in Hebrews 7. Another curiosity is, what did Melchizedek do with the tithe of the spoils if this was just another brief manifestation of the Lord? We're not actually told in the account. And perhaps his angels distributed the tithe to the poor of the land. We will never know. Now, the information I'm about to share with you comes from an excellent Ambassador College lecture series by Richard Page called Archaeology and History. Now, it's usually assumed that the patriarchs, Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob, were just shepherds or herders of livestock. Now, if they were just shepherds, the following passage in Genesis 46 would seem rather out of place. Now, Joseph is getting ready for his family to move down to Egypt, and then says to his brothers, if the Pharaoh asks you what your occupation is, I want you to tell him that you tend livestock. He then says that shepherds are an abomination to the Egyptians. Now, if they were just shepherds or herders of livestock already, why would Joseph feel the need to prep his brothers and his father to give this particular answer? Now, it would seem that they were much more than just herders of livestock. Now, Joseph tells them just to focus on this one part of your overall business, so the Pharaoh will give you the land of Goshen. Now, we get a glimpse of their primary business in Genesis 34. Now, one of the men of Shechem has slept with Jacob's daughter Dinah, despite them not being married. Now, he goes to his father to arrange with Jacob for Dinah's hand in marriage. His father then says to Jacob, the soul of my son Shechem longs for your daughter. Please give her to him as a wife, and make marriages with us. Give us your daughters to us, and take our daughters to yourself. So you shall dwell with us, and the land shall be before you. And notice this, trade and dwell in it, and acquire possessions for yourselves in it. So it would seem that the patriarch's main business was as mercantile traders trading goods. Now, this would explain a few things in the accounts of the lives of Abraham and Jacob. Now, if Abraham was a mercantile trader of goods, This would explain why he had as many as 318 armed servants in Genesis 14. It would also explain why Abraham was mingling so close enough to the Pharaoh for Sarah to be noticed by the Pharaoh, given their attitude towards shepherds. Now, if they were just shepherds, they wouldn't have mingled in such high society in Egypt. Now, it would also explain why Abraham was called a mighty prince by the men in Hebron in Genesis 23, and why he mostly bases himself close to the cities on the ridge route. And further, it would explain why Joseph prepped his father and brothers to concentrate on just the shepherding part of their trade in order to dwell in the land of Goshen. Now, the main locations that Abraham and Jacob are moving between also give strong support to the patriarch's main business being as mercantile traders of various goods that would be purchased from the main caravans that travel between Egypt and Mesopotamia on the Via Maris and the King's Highway, and then sold to the retailers and towns in the land of Israel. Now, the Via Maris and the King's Highway are shown here in dark blue. Now, running in between them is the Central Highlands and the ridge route known as the Way of the Patriarchs. Now, there are 4 key towns in the Central Highlands where Abraham and Jacob travelled between: Shechem and Bethel in the north, and Hebron and Beersheba in the south. Now, all 4 of these towns are on the ridge route where there are crossroads shown here in orange between the Via Maris and the King's Highway. Now, in Genesis 20 verse 1 it says, "And Abraham journeyed from there to the south and dwelt between Kadesh and Shur and stayed in Gerar." Now, he went deep into the Negev way south of Beersheba before heading back to Gerar. So that begs the question, why would he have done such a thing? Well, perhaps he was trying to get the jump on other traders doing business with the caravans coming out of Egypt. Now, Gerar, where Abraham interacted with the Philistines, including Abimelech, is on the road between Beersheba and Gaza, where there was plentiful water for their herds. Now, in Genesis 13, after Abraham and Lot separated, God reiterates the promise that his descendants would become a great nation and that both Abraham and his descendants would inherit the land forever. Now, since Abraham died without inheriting the promises, as it says in Hebrews 11:13, this implies a future resurrection and an eternal life in order to inherit it forever. Now, in Genesis 15, God appears to Abraham in a vision approximately 10 years after he comes into the land. Now, Abraham asks, how can the promise of a great nation from him be fulfilled, since he has no children, and that his heir is his servant Eliezer? Now, the fact that Eliezer, a servant, is his heir and not his nephew Lot, who is not too far away in the land, is intriguing, but it is consistent with the customs of the time. A servant could be adopted and be considered part of the family, even more than a blood relative who was in the land but not directly under the authority of the patriarch. But God tells him here that a son from his own body would then become his heir. Now, God in this vision then tells Abraham to look towards the heavens and says, "Your descendants will be as numerous as the stars." And Abraham trusts God that he will bring it to pass, despite the fact that he is now about 85 years old. Now, then God formalises the covenant with a common covenant ritual from the time where they would cut several animals in half, and God symbolically walked through the cut pieces. By walking through the cut animals, the covenant maker was essentially saying, "Let what happened to these animals happen to me if I do not fulfill my part of the covenant." Now, God promises Abraham's descendants that they would inherit all the land from the river of Egypt to the Euphrates. Now, the river or brook of Egypt here is not the Nile River, but the Wadi El Arish that bisects the north of the Sinai Peninsula. Now notice also that it is to Abraham's descendants that the land will go to, not just to Jacob's descendants, who later became the nation of Israel. Now Abraham had other descendants who were not Israelites, such as Esau's descendants, as well as Ishmael's descendants who inherited the whole Saudi Arabian peninsula, which technically is between the River of Egypt and the Euphrates. Now God had promised Abraham a son. Now the detail of Sarah being the mother of this child, which God promised, has not been specifically mentioned yet. Now Sarah, who's now around 75 years old, is barren, and she has an Egyptian maidservant called Hagar. Now in the customs of the day, if a woman was barren, she could provide a surrogate woman from her servants, and any child from this arrangement would legally be the child of the barren woman. Now this is why she says, perhaps I shall obtain children from her. Now rather than confirm with God if such an arrangement was what God had in mind, Sarah took matters into her own hands and convinced Abraham to go through with it. Now she conceives, and soon thereafter starts looking down on Sarah, knowing she is going to bear a child unlike Sarah. Now Sarah responds harshly in return, and Hagar flees. An angel of God persuades her to go back, and then she gives birth to Ishmael. Now, Abraham is about 86 years old when Ishmael is born. Now some 15 years later, in chapter 21, when Isaac has been born and Abraham holds a feast after he is weaned, Sarah overhears Ishmael scoffing in derision, probably because he is no longer the centre of attention. Now Sarah snaps and asks Abraham to cast out Hagar and Ishmael. Now Abraham is reluctant to do so because he loves Ishmael, but God tells him to let Sarah have her way in this matter, and that he would look after Ishmael after they leave Abraham. Now after Hagar and Ishmael depart, God promises Hagar that he would make a great nation from Ishmael. Now the descendants of Ishmael became the people we know today as the Arabs. And that promise of a great nation was fulfilled in the time from the 600s AD, when the Arab Empire expanded to a size even greater than the Roman Empire. Now, if Ishmael becoming a great nation meant an empire larger in area than the Roman Empire, then how much greater are the birthright promises that God promised would come through Isaac's descendants? Now, Ishmael's descendants have felt the birthright promises belong to them, and that being fed by the new religion of Islam, and have often, as a result of that, been in conflict with Israel. Now, what would have happened if Sarah and Abraham had simply waited for God to provide the solution and not taken matters into their own hands? I mean, perhaps generations of strife could have been avoided in the Middle East. The geopolitical scene in the Middle East today might be very different, with the ever-present threat of war being much diminished. Now this leads us to our third lesson from Abraham's life. Compromises lead to inferior results and should be avoided. Now we see this in the matter of Hagar and Ishmael, and also in Abraham's half-truth about Sarah. And we saw the jealousy that occurred between Hagar and Ishmael towards Sarah, and Isaac and Sarah towards Hagar and Ishmael. Now in the matter of the half-truth about Sarah being his sister, Abraham may have saved his skin, but in both cases he almost lost his wife twice. The only thing that prevented that was God's intervention and God's desire to fulfill the promises through Sarah. So, as a result of that, let us be truthful at all times and not compromise with God's law. Now, if we fail to do so, we might have some short-term benefits, but the results in the long term will be much inferior, just like in Abraham's life with the compromises that he made in two important areas of his life. Now, and on that note, that concludes part one at this look of the life of Abraham. In part two, when I'll be back up here next month, we'll look at the remainder of Abraham's life and draw out further lessons that we can learn from the life of the father of the faithful. Well, happy Sabbath to you all, and welcome back to the Biography channel and to part 2 of Lessons from Abraham. Now, in part 1 we saw how God called Abraham from his country in northern Mesopotamia to the land of Canaan, which would later become the land of Israel, the new name of his grandson Jacob. Now, we also saw that God chose Abraham and promised to develop his descendants into a group of influential nations chosen for the purpose of teaching and being an example of his way of life to the rest of the world. Now, God had promised Abraham a son through whom God would develop a great nation. Now, we saw that Sarah, who was in her 70s at the time of Genesis 15, was barren, and she took matters into her own hand regarding God's promise of his son and convinced Abraham to have a child through her handmaid Hagar. Now, legally, in the customs of the day, the child would be Sarah's, even though Hagar was the surrogate mother. Now, soon after Abraham has a son through Hagar, whose name was Ishmael. Now, when Abraham is 99 years old, the Lord visibly appears to him again to further expand on the promises he is making with Abraham. Now, God makes it clear that it is Sarah who will give birth to the son he has promised them, and that she would become a mother of nations. Now, God changes the name of both Abram and Sarai to Abraham and Sarah to emphasise the promise he has made to them. Now, God changes Abram's name to Abraham and Sarai's name to Sarah. Now, Abram means exalted father or father of height, which might imply he was quite tall. Abraham means also father of nations, and Sarah means princess, while Sarah means queen. Now, in ancient blood covenants, there was often, as part of that covenant, an exchange of names that took place. Now, this is likely to be the origin of a wife taking on the name of her husband. Now, after God made a covenant with Abraham, Abram and Sarai both received the H from Yahweh and became known as Abraham and Sarah. God also then became known as the God of Abraham. Now, Abraham falls on his face before God and laughs as he thinks to himself, "Shall Sarah have a child at 90 years old?" He then tries to convince God to work the promises through Ishmael, who he is very fond of as his only son at this point. And God tells him no, Sarah will bear a child, and he will establish the birthright covenant through him. Now, having noticed Abraham's reaction of laughter, God has a thought in response to that. He tells Abraham, "I want you to name him Isaac," which is a name that means laughter. Now, in Genesis 21:12, it says that his descendants will be named after Isaac. And one fulfillment of this are the descendants of his grandson Joseph, who became known as the Saxons, who the British people and many of us Aussies are descended from. Now, the name Saxons means sons of Isaac, but translated more fully, the name Saxons actually means sons of laughter, which I think is very correct, as I believe English and American communities make the best of English. Now, before Abraham and Sarah, who was beyond childbearing age, had a child together, God gave Abraham a new name that meant father of a multitude of nations. Now, this illustrated a point as found over in Romans 4, verse 17, where it says that God calls those which don't exist as though they already do. In Romans 4:21, it points out that after Abraham's initial reaction that he was fully, not partially convinced that God would perform what he promised to do, which would require something supernatural for Sarah to bear a child. Now, back a few verses in Romans 4:13, Paul adds a detail that's not seen in the book of Genesis, where we see an expansion of the promise to Abraham's seed from not just the land of Canaan, but a promise to be heir and inherit the whole world. Now there would be a physical seed who would inherit the land of Canaan and the birthright lands around the world which the English-speaking nations came to colonise and possess. But there would also be a spiritual seed of Abraham who would inherit the whole world. Now Paul speaks of Christians being the spiritual descendants of Abraham in Galatians 3 verse 29. Albert Barnes in his commentary on Romans 4:13 writes, when the apostle calls him the heir of the world, he sums up in this comprehensive expression all the promises made to Abraham, intimating that his spiritual descendants, that is, those who possess his faith, shall yet be so numerous as to possess all lands. End of quote. Now, while there is no promise of Abraham's descendants inheriting the whole world in Genesis, we do see that the idea of his spiritual descendants inheriting the world in other places in the Old Testament. Now, one place is where David says in Psalm 37 that the meek shall inherit the earth, which Jesus quoted in the Sermon on the Mount. Now, Daniel also saw a vision of the saints inheriting the kingdom of God and ruling the earth with Jesus Christ in Daniel 7. Now, Mamre is mentioned as a site where Abraham dwelt near Hebron, a little to its north. Now, the site is today called Ramat al-Khalil, which means friend of God. Now, it has a large enclosure around it built by Herod the Great, which was built over an earlier enclosure thought to be dated possibly to the time of David. Now, the centre of this site is the remains of an altar. Now, Abraham built an altar at Mamre according to Genesis 13 verse 18. Now, there's a spring within that enclosure that is seen at the back of the photo on the right. Now, near a spring is a good place where trees would grow, such as the oaks described in the verses shown here. Now, it was here at Mamre that the Lord again appeared to Abraham to reconfirm his promise he would have a son on his way to deal with the sins that he's heard about Sodom. Now, long after God appears to Abraham again at Mamre near Hebron with two other men who are angels who later go down to retrieve Lot from Sodom. Now, Abraham quickly prepares a meal for them. Now, he prepares some venison meat along with some dairy products, both milk and butter, and they eat what he set before them. Now, if you go to Israel today, they have a very strange interpretation of the statute of not boiling a kid in its mother's milk, where they will not mix dairy products and meat together in a meal. Now, some restaurants are duplex in nature, where you eat dairy and wine and then go next door to eat meat. Now, if you ever go to Israel, don't ever ask for some meat on your pizza, as I did not once but twice. Now, this example of Abraham here of eating butter, milk and venison together shows the Jewish interpretation of this statute is completely incorrect. Now, when Sarah, like Abraham, laughs at the news that she would bear a son at her age, she is asked a very good question that we should think about when we feel doubt over God's promises. Is there anything too hard for the Lord? Now, Abraham knows that Lot and his family are living down there in Sodom, and he knows that the Lord has come to destroy it. Now, it's interesting that the Lord says, I will go down and see whether what they've done according to the outcry that has come up to me. Now, we might think of God as having a bank of TV screens seeing everything. Now, while he could know everything that way, if he chose to, we find that the angels report to him and he decides to personally investigate himself. Now, hoping to save Lot and any of his household beyond his immediate family, remember Lot's herdsmen from chapter 13. Abraham humbly pleads with God to spare Sodom if there are 50 righteous amongst the wicked. Now Abraham is quite bold about it, saying, "Would you also destroy the righteous with the wicked? Suppose there were 50 righteous within the city, would you also destroy the place and not spare it for the 50 righteous that were in it? Far be it from you to do such a thing as this, to slay the righteous with the wicked." And the Lord graciously agrees not to destroy the city if there are 50 righteous people in it. And not knowing whether it is enough to spare Lot's household, Abraham continues to negotiate with God a number of times, bringing the number all the way down to 10. And it's almost like an option. Do I hear 50? How about 40? Do I hear 30, 20, 10, and so on? Now Abraham probably feels he's done enough to spare the city and Lot's family, but it turns out that there are not even 10 righteous people in the city. Now, despite there not being 10 righteous people, God has already decided to spare Lot's family, which he has assigned the 2 angels to take care of. Now, the boldness in which Abraham interceded for the lives of the people of Sodom should be reflected in our own prayer life with God. Now, we know we sin quite regularly, but as long as we are striving to go in the right direction, we should trust in the gracious, kind and merciful character of God whenever we intercede for others and for our own pressing needs. Now in Hebrews 4:16, Paul tells us to come boldly to the throne of grace that we may obtain mercy and find grace to help in time of need. Now this brings us to the 4th lesson that we can learn from the life of Abraham. Be bold in your prayer life with God, trusting that he will be merciful and gracious in the way that he responds. Now the 2 angels go down to Sodom and Lot takes them into his house. Now a whole group of men, both young and old, surround Lot's house and demand Lot to turn over the strangers so they can basically gang rape them. Now in Genesis 15:16, God said he would not dispossess the land and give it to Abraham's descendants until the 4th generation, as the sins of the Amorites were not yet full. Now with Sodom and Gomorrah, he makes an exception because of their level of sin had come to the full, as demonstrated by their example here of homosexual lust. Now I don't know about you, but I remember a 10-part drama series called The Bible, which has some terribly liberal interpretations of Scripture. Now they avoided this homosexual scene altogether, and then had the 2 angels, one looking like a black guy and the other looking like an Asian guy, then kill more people with their swords than the true means of death by fire and brimstone. Now we see in this story that Lot is not unaffected by the moral corruption surrounding him, though it grieved him. Now he offers his daughters if they would leave his guests alone. And then the angels then blind the crowd of Sodomites. Now the angels then tell Lot and his family to flee to the mountains as the city is about to be destroyed and not to look back. Now Lot's sons-in-law ridicule the message and they stay put. The angels, after Lot's family linger, grab Lot, his wife and daughters and take them out of the city. Now despite the moral corruption, there appears to have been a high degree of physical affluence there, and Lot's wife doesn't want to say goodbye to Sodom. And as she turns back, she is turned into a pillar of salt. Now when Jesus compared the events of the Great Tribulation ahead of us to the time of Sodom's destruction, he warned us not to be like Lot's wife in Luke 17:32, wanting more of what this immoral world offers than obeying God and fleeing when necessary. Now early in the morning, God then rained fire and brimstone and destroyed the cities of the plain. Now in a previous message on the Exodus, I showed the evidence that points to the Exodus occurring at the end of Egypt's Middle Kingdom in the Middle Bronze Age, rather than the conventionally accepted Late Bronze Age, where there is no evidence at all for the Exodus. Now the end of the Middle Kingdom is dated to about 315 years earlier than the Exodus. Now if the Exodus was at the end of the Middle Kingdom, then the dates for both the Old and Middle Kingdom would have to move at least 300 years forward in time. Now, conventional chronology places the end of the Old Kingdom in 2150 BC. So if we move this date 300 years forward, we come up with a date of around 1850 BC. Now, that date of 1850 BC just happens to coincide with the biblical catastrophe that destroyed Sodom and Gomorrah in the time of Abraham. Now, commenting on the magnitude of events which brought an end to the early Bronze Age, Kathleen Kenyon writes, "The final end of the early Bronze Age civilization came with catastrophic completeness. Jericho was probably completely destroyed. Every town in Palestine that has so far been investigated shows the same break. All traces of the early Bronze Age civilization disappeared," in a quote. Now, Ernest Wright also wrote, "One of the most striking facts about the early Bronze civilization is its destruction. One so violent that scarcely a vestige of it survived. We do not know when the event took place. We only know that there is not an early Bronze Age city excavated or explored in all Palestine which does not have a gap in its occupation between early Bronze Age 3 and the Middle Bronze Age." Now, Geoffrey Gammon, in an article entitled "Bronze Age Destructions in the Near East," also wrote, "The end of the early Bronze 3, however, was marked by destructions in all regions of Western Asia. According to Schaefer, Troy 3 was covered by a layer of ash 16 metres thick." And Claude Schaefer, in his Comparative Stratigraphy and Chronology of Western Asia, also wrote, "At Tarsus, that's the city where the Apostle Paul came from in southeast Turkey, a fire level has been found between 12 and 13 metres deep among the upper layers of the early Bronze Age." Now, Tarsus is on the opposite side of Turkey from where Troy was. Now, Schaefer found evidence of two major catastrophes during the early Bronze Age. Now, Schaefer dated these two early Bronze catastrophes to the end of the early Bronze 2 period and at the end of the early Bronze 3 period. Now, conventionally, these are dated to 2350 and 2100 BC. Now, if we lower the date of the early Bronze 2 catastrophe, which was one primarily of fire, by a similar amount as we lower the end of the Old Kingdom's life, we come up with a date of about 2100 BC. Now, there's another biblical catastrophe referred to in the scriptures that matches this date, and that's the destruction of the Tower of Babel. And this destruction is likely to be the same as that detected at the end of the early Bronze 2 period. Now, the latter early Bronze 3 catastrophe was one of great fire and earthquake. Now, in a London Sunday Times article, Rajiv Sayal wrote, "A cataclysmic shower of giant meteors destroyed the great Bronze Age civilizations in Egypt, Mesopotamia and Greece by provoking a series of natural disasters. New archaeological and astronomical evidence indicates that a huge number of extraterrestrial bodies caused famine, flooding and bushfires thousands of miles wide that led to the collapse of the world's first sophisticated civilizations. British scientists have also identified at least 7 impact craters which were formed within the century of 2350 BC, which they believe may have been part of a great meteor storm. Craters recently found in Argentina date from around the same period, suggesting that the Earth may have been hit by a shower of large meteors about at the same time. Now, the Dead Sea, according to the Genesis account, appears to have not yet been in existence in the days of Abraham. In its place, there was a fertile plain known as the plain of Shittim. Now, in Genesis 13:10, we read, "When Lot arrived in the region, he lifted up his eyes and beheld all of the plain of Jordan, that it was well watered everywhere like the garden of the Lord." Then it notes that this was before the Lord destroyed Sodom and Gomorrah. Now, to have been well watered, this plain would have needed to be at least as high as the mountains that form the current watershed. Now, east of this watershed, little water from the coast passes and falls as rain in the Judean wilderness, so that's why it's so arid today. Now, the great rift of the Jordan and the Dead Sea bears witness to a tremendous upheaval. Professor M. Blankenhorn wrote, with the end of the Tertiary period, in an event of extreme violence, the entire Syrian land from its south end to its north end was torn apart, and the ground in between sank into the depths. Now, even the beautiful, end of quote there, now even the beautiful Sea of Galilee is some 600 feet below sea level. Now, only when you go further up to Tel Dan and its nearby springs does it again hit sea level again. Now, that whole valley area between Tel Dan and the northern end of the Sea of Galilee is full of basalt, telltale signs of great volcanic lava flows in the past. Now, in Psalm 126, verse 4, we read, "Turn again our captivity as the streams in the south." Now, did the Jordan previously flow through the Jezreel Valley towards the Mediterranean Sea before the sinking of the Jordan Valley? Did perhaps another river flow into the Red Sea, starting from the springs in the Dead Sea like the Spring of Engedi? Now, I'd be very curious to know exactly what the topography of this area looked like before that destruction of Sodom and Gomorrah. Now, the sheer violence of the Sodom and Gomorrah catastrophe by fire and brimstone that sank the Jordan Valley explains the rather unusual reaction of Lot's daughters. In Genesis 19, verses 31 to 32, we read, "And the firstborn said to the younger, Our father is old, and there is no man in the earth to come into us in all the way of the earth. Come, let us make our father drink wine, and we will lie with him, so that we may preserve the seed of our father." Now, they thought that there were no other survivors left on the face of the earth, including their husbands who stayed behind in Sodom, and went to the drastic step of getting their father drunk to have sex in order to have children. Now, in Genesis 21, God then follows through on his promise to give Abraham a son through Sarah, and Isaac is born when Abraham is 100 years old. Now, Sarah is 90 years old and loves the name Isaac that God has chosen, for she says, "God has made me laugh, and all who hear will laugh with me." Now, following his treaty with Abimelech, it says in Genesis 21, verse 23, that Abraham planted a grove, that's in the King James, which is translated tamarisk tree in some other versions. Now, planting a tree as part of a covenant was a custom in patriarchal times. Now, such sacred trees were representative of the religious or sacred area near a city. So we often see Abraham in the religious area, such as Mamre, when God appeared to him when they discussed the fate of Sodom. Now, there was a sacred tree also at Shechem, what's known as the Oak of Moreh. Now, it features in the story of Jacob, where he buries his clan's earrings and idols as he rededicates his family to God. Now, the oak is still there at Shechem when Joshua and the Israelites rededicated their covenant with God after they recited the blessings and cursings between the two mountains. The stone that Joshua set up next to it was found next to the remains of the fortress temple of El Berith, meaning Lord of the Covenant. Now, the association of idolatry with groves later became too strong that God then forbade the Israelites from planting a grove near an altar of the Lord, as it says in Deuteronomy 16:21. Now, in Genesis 22, God then decides to test Abraham. Now, we know that he has visibly appeared to him at least 4 times, plus another in vision, not counting a possible reference in Genesis 12 in Haran. Now, he talks to Abraham here, though this may be another visible appearance, and tells him to take his only son, Ishmael and Hagar, that had previously been sent away, and offer Isaac as a burnt sacrifice. Now, notice it is to happen on one of the mountains in the land of Moriah. Now, imagine your reaction if God asked you to do such a thing. I mean, you would be shocked and disbelief, no doubt, would have been his first reaction. Now, in verse 3, it then simply says that he got ready and did what God was it as simple as a matter of fact as this concise account might lead us to believe? Was there any reaction, hurt and anger before he forced himself to do as God commanded, as shown in the famous 1960s Bible movie In the Beginning? I remember a minister in another church totally ruling out such a possible reaction. Now, no doubt Abraham would have initially thought it was inconsistent with God's loving character to ask him to sacrifice his son, like we see happens with other pagan gods. Now, being human like the rest of us, it is not out of the question that Abraham may have had some initial hurt and anger towards God as he wrestled with this command to give up his long-awaited promised son. Now, we do not know how he emotionally reacted, but we do know how he logically processed such a request that initially would have made no sense at all. Now, Abraham had to be sure that God and not some other spirit being from the dark side was making this request to him. But once sure on that point, Abraham knew that God had promised nations would come specifically through Isaac, not some other later replacement son. Now, as the wheels turned in his head, he concluded that the only way that God could possibly fulfill that promise, if he slew Isaac as a burnt sacrifice, would be if God were to resurrect Isaac. Now, what you have to realise about how brave a decision this was to obey God here was that there was no precedent. At this point in man's history, no one has ever been resurrected physically back to life. Now, the first example in the Bible is Elijah raising up the widow's son. Now, the Bible doesn't tell us how old Isaac was at the time. Now, he is referred to as a lad in most translations, but this word can also mean a young man. Now, did Abraham eventually tell Isaac what he was commanded by God to do? And did Isaac submit to it willingly? Now, the chances are high that both of those things actually happened, even though the scripture is silent about it. Now, Abraham offering Isaac was a type of God the Father offering up his only son. Now, we know that Jesus willingly submitted to what the Father had decreed should happen to pay for our sins. Now, Isaac was a type of Jesus giving up his life for us, so he probably submitted willingly, given that he would have been old enough to probably physically overpower his elderly father. Now, it is assumed that this mountain in the land of Moriah was where the Temple Mount is today. But since it was a type of God offering up his son, it may have happened where Jesus Christ himself was killed. Now, there's some good symbolic evidence pointing to the Mount of Olives as being the place where the crucifixion occurred, as this was where the sin offerings and the red heifer were killed to the east of the temple. Now, Abraham would have gone through with slaying his son were it not for the intervention of an angel telling him to stop, and God then provides a ram to sacrifice instead that is caught in a thicket. Now, Leonard Woolley at the more famous Ur found a beautiful gold-plated sculpture which is in the British Museum today. Now, back in the 1930s, when the interest and respect for the Bible was much higher, it was labelled as a ram in the thicket. However, the horns on this sculpture here are the straight horns of a goat rather than the curved horns of a ram. Now, Abraham's willingness to give up his only son Isaac brings us to our fifth lesson that we can learn from Abraham's life. True living faith or trusting God is demonstrated and proven by fully obedient actions. In James 2, verses 20 to 22, James wrote, "Faith without works is dead. Was not Abraham our father justified by works when he offered Isaac, his son, on the altar? Do you see that faith was working together with his works, and by works faith was made perfect?" Now, if you believe God, you will prove it by doing your best to obey his laws with the help and power of God. Now, what you do proves how much you believe God's laws are best deep down in your heart. Now, there are three places in the Bible where Abraham is referred to as the friend of God. The first place is in 2 Chronicles 20, verse 7. The second place is in Isaiah 41, verse 8. And the last place is in James 2, verse 23. Now, in that last place is in the context of his faith and obedience, being willing to offer his son Isaac. Now, we've seen that there have been a few occasions where God had appeared to Abraham, like when he first told Abraham that he would inherit the land, and also where he appeared to him at Mamre and discussed the fate of Sodom. In Exodus 33, verse 11, it says that the Lord spoke to Moses face to face as a man speaks to his friend. Now, this honourable description of being the friend of God was probably applied to God not just because of his faith and obedience, but also because of the face-to-face conversations that the two had at times. In Genesis 24, God wants to find a wife for his son Isaac. He is insistent that he does not marry a Canaanite woman, showing a very strong preference for him to marry a woman of his own people. So he commissions his old servant to go back and find a wife for Isaac. The servant asks God for a sign that shows that the woman has a caring, service-orientated attitude by offering not just him but his animals water as well from the local well. The woman God selects for Isaac is Rebekah, the granddaughter of Abraham's father Nahor, and she agrees to the match, returning with Abraham's servant to the land of Canaan. Now, Sarah was 127 years old when she died, and Abraham lived another 38 years after her death. We also read that Abraham took another wife named Keturah, and despite Abraham's old age, he has an amazing 6 more sons through Keturah. Now, the best known of these sons was Midian. If you remember when Moses fled, he fled to the land of Midian in northwest Saudi Arabia, where he married the daughter of Jethro, who was a priest of Midian. Now, in Genesis 23, verse 19, we read that Abraham buried Sarah, his wife, in the cave of the field of Machpelah. Now, the Hebrew word Machpelah means double or twofold, implying a double cave. Now, it became the tomb for 3 patriarchal couples, Abraham and Sarah, Isaac and Rebekah, and Jacob and Leah. Now, Jacob's favourite wife, Rachel, was buried in a tomb closer to Bethlehem. Now, remember that Leah, who was buried here with Jacob, was the mother of Judah. So these 3 patriarchal couples were the first 3 couples of the land of Israel for the lineage of King David. Now, this site has become an important holy site for the Jews. King Herod, an Edomite who was raised in the Jewish religion, built the structure above the caves. Now, its stones are very similar to the stones of the temple in Jerusalem, yet it wasn't destroyed by the Romans, and it has survived intact to this day. It is in the West Bank territory and is part mosque, though open to tourists. Quite hoping to visit there when I next go to Israel. Now, the excavations at nearby Tel Hebron have uncovered city walls dating to both the early and middle Bronze Age, and some steps leading up to the city gate. Now, Abraham lived in that transition period between the early and middle Bronze periods, and would have been at the city gate where he negotiated the purchase of the cave of the field of Machpelah. Now, we read in Genesis 25 that Abraham died at the ripe old age of 175 and was buried in the same tomb that he purchased for his wife Sarah. Now, one thing that is touching in the story of his funeral is that Ishmael was able to come back and join Isaac to bury their father. Now, Nahum, a member of the Jewish community of Hebron, tells a story in a YouTube video that he was part of a group back in the 1980s that, in the middle of the night, broke through the floor stones and found a passageway down to a double cave where they found human bones and pottery and artefacts from the Middle Bronze and First Temple periods. Now, before we conclude today, I'm just going to play an extract from that video, plus another video about Hebron by Joel Kramer, who's an archaeologist and does tours of Israel covering many of these West Bank biblical sites that get missed on most sites, tours of Israel.
Actually, the cave is located right beneath this memorial. And we have here 3 couples, Abraham and Sarah, Isaac and Rebecca, Jacob and Leah.
So the actual bones are down underneath here?
Yes, underneath.
How did you discover it?
Well, it was in the middle of the night, one of the last nights of the Jewish calendar, and there are special prayers, and people come here and blow the shofar and sing many songs. So there was a lot of noise, and we, covered by that noise, we got the tools to open the gates of heaven, like hammers, like chisels.
That was decades ago, and no one is allowed in the cave anymore.
There were some stairs leading to a dark and long tunnel. We have crawled through this tunnel. We took some stones from the floor, and then we discovered the cave. Actually, it's 2 caves. I found myself crawling amongst human bones. So it's really to touch the history, to touch the Bible.
So this is Hebron. So that's the Acropolis of the hill. That hasn't been excavated because it's a vulnerable place to do excavations in the past because of the tension. But that's certainly where, most likely where David's palace is located. So I want you to put David's palace up there and put King David up there for 7.5 years, ruling as a king of Judah, looking down on the ancestral tomb of his forefathers and mothers, where we just were. Now again, buried in that tomb is the specific lineage of Judah. His mother was Leah and Jacob, and you are standing in the heart of the territory of Judah. Mamre is on the road that connects Jerusalem to Hebron. On the road from Jerusalem to Hebron, Mamre is right off of that road. The opening line of the New Testament says, Matthew 1:1, a record of the genealogy of Jesus Christ, the son of David, the son of Abraham.
Okay, so in conclusion, Abraham was the great patriarch whose family God began to work with to develop his chosen nation to model his way of life to the rest of the world as part of his great plan to reconcile all mankind to himself. In Matthew 8 verse 11, Jesus said that many will sit down with Abraham and the patriarchs in the kingdom of heaven. Abraham indeed was the father of the faithful, and today, and in our previous message, we looked at 5 key lessons that we can learn from his life. Now those 5 lessons in summary are: have the courage to leave what is comfortable and follow God even when you're not sure where doing it God's way will take you. Second, humility and deference to the needs of others is vital to living at peace with others. 3, compromises lead to inferior results and should be avoided. 4, be bold in your prayer life with God, trusting that he will be merciful and gracious in the way that he responds. And 5, true living faith or trust in God is demonstrated and proven by fully obedient actions. So let's learn from the lessons of his life and be on his true, faithful spiritual descendant.